About 2,500 people have been killed in militant attacks in the Democratic Republic of Congo between May 2021 and April 2022. 14 people, including children, lost their lives at a displacement camp this week. An armed group known as CODECO is suspected to be behind the attack. Joining us from New York to help unpack the surge in violence is Joint Civil-Military Interaction Network Deputy Director Dr. Yvan Yenda Ilunga, who's also a political sciences Central State University professor. Dr. Ilunga, good evening. Thank you for your time. Talk to us about who CODECO are and what the reason is behind for this unfortunate massacre.
Good evening, dear Hugo, and thank you so much for having me, and it's good to be here. I think the question that you raised is important, and maybe it will be very difficult to only define one group. As you rightly pointed, that since April of last year, there's been different massacres, and especially in the eastern parts of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this has been committed by different groups, armed groups, of course, with different claims and reclamations. But what I think is quite important in all this to understand is that the trend of violence is growing, and the tactics that these groups are using are becoming more and more diverse. So, for instance, we have the M23 and we have CODECO. So we have different mode of operandis. But the biggest challenge here, I think, is not on the capabilities of the armed groups, but I think the lack of effective responses from the DRC government, which need to be analyzed, and also somehow indirectly questioned the relevance of the UN mission that is operating in terms of support for the DRC in the same region.
Well, Dr. Ilunga, President Felix Tshisekedi enacted a state of siege in North Kivu and Ituri to combat this specific problem. Clearly, it hasn't been successful.
Well, definitely not, because if it was successful today, we would be talking of less casualties in civilians. And that's why, for instance, a few weeks ago, he had requested the support of the East African community countries in terms of supporting the DRC on that. But here again, the biggest thing is not actually about just saying this is a specific techniques or tactics or states of siege in this case that need to be put in place. But it's also important to understand the root causes of this conflict. And I personally believe that this conflict and these massacres and violence in the eastern parts of the DRC will not only end through military means. So there are some economic factors, or social factors, ethnic factors, and actually based on identities, which also need to be put in place in terms of creating, I think, a dynamic and a space of conversation where different factions will have to come together and talk, of course, in addition to the military option, which is already in place, but has not produced the expected results as we would want to see it at this point.
Well, so there's also some social unrest, if you will, in that the citizens of the DRC have been made promises, and many of them have been complaining about some of these promises that have not been kept. I mean, we're talking about schooling, infrastructure, transport, and such issues that are causing conflict or problems within those communities.
Yes, but again, I would not try to portray this only on the current regime. I think the issues of the dynamics of the social contract in Africa is a real problem where governments sometimes fail, actually not sometimes, but often fail to honor their commitment toward the citizens. And unfortunately, the eastern part of the DRC, which has been affected for years of conflict, makes it even difficult for government to deliver on other fronts. So the insecurity, for instance, means resources which were supposed, for instance, to be allocated to social services and including education and health, being either channeled toward the military, or at least that will say the security operations, or again, the dimension of corruption, which is also endemic and needs to be seen as one of the reasons for this lack of effective response and support to civilians, not only in the eastern parts of the DRC, but also other provinces and towns as well, who continue to ask for the same type of assistance and not getting it the right way.
Dr. Ilunga, before we let you go, there's been a joint transition plan developed by the United Nations. What does it state? Has it been successful? Are we seeing any progress in that regard?
Well, actually, as you said, I'm in New York exactly for that type of conversation. I think it's too soon to call it a success or even a failure, because it was officially actually accepted and incorporated into the new MONUSCO mandate in December of last year. So we are still in a very early stage of that transition. But at least one thing needs to be made clear here is that this transition provides an inclusive, a very open space for multiple approaches and sectoral approaches to what needs to be done in the DRC. For instance, the transition speaks to the idea of building institutions. It goes, again, this plan to speak to this question which has been pending for a long time, the question of natural resources, management of natural resources in the DRC. It also speaks to security sector reform and, of course, the building institutions at the local as well as national level. So, yes, the transition plan has been agreed by the DRC government and MONUSCO, but right now the tendency seems to be more that of putting more pressure on MONUSCO rather than combining MONUSCO and the DRC. So if I may allow to say that, you may allow me to say that, I think the call should also be put on the DRC government, because at the end of it, it's a Congolese issue which needs to be addressed primarily by Congolese government as well as its citizens. So we cannot expect outsiders to do what they did not do in the past 20 or 22 years.
Dr. Yvan Ilunga speaking to us from New York. Thank you for your time this evening. He was unpacking the spike in violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo.